And for those of you that are interested in art and science, this is not the only thing. If you go to the Museum of Art, there's an exhibit on art and science, which is really spectacular, so I urge you all to go and visit it in the next few months. Now, the universities like ours, I think, are at the core of having a functional democracy because we educate not only our students, but we're supposed to educate our community. And these days, more than ever, educating everybody gets complicated because there's an enormous amount of factoids and facts and misinformation that is out there because of the advent of digital information. This lecture series is all about that, but before we get into the lecture itself, I'm honored to introduce to all of you somebody that really doesn't need an introduction, President Robbins, who's here to welcome all of you as well.
Good evening, everyone. I got to say a few words last year. I'm thankful that Joaquin allowed me to come back tonight. Thank you all for all being here. Now 14th season, is that 14 years? Incredible. We're going to get to hear an incredible lecture from Dr. Masel tonight. I understand she was in the first lecture 14 years ago. She spoke at this event. Probably many of you are here. Thank you for continuing to come back. It's just an incredible lineup of people every year that Joaquin puts this together, and I'm impressed. I really enjoyed it last year. And I'm looking forward to tonight's lecture. And the only thing I can say about, is there certainty? The only certain thing is it's uncertain whether there's certainty, right? So you can never predict, but we think the sun will come up over there tomorrow and go down over there. Joanna Russell, who I think you're third on the list for a lecture, and I did check my calendar and I'll be here, so I'll be tweeting, yes. Incredible individuals that we have at this university. And thank you for being so supportive here and supporting this lecture series. This last year, a few months ago, Joaquin won a very well-deserved award from the country of Mexico as being a treasure to that country. And as I said a few minutes ago, yeah. My friend, you have served this institution for so long and so well, and you're certainly a University of Arizona and a Arizona treasure, and I'm proud to call you my friend, and congratulations on the continued success of this lecture series. Thank you.
Thank you, President Robbins. And now I just want to briefly go through, you know that this lecture series is actually quite expensive. That's why none of you have to pay at the entrance. So they're underwriters that support us. And today I just want to highlight two of them. These are the title sponsors. TEP has been with us since day one, supporting about probably 50% of the expenses of this lecture series. And the Office of Research, Discovery, and Innovation, which for many of you would also be understood as the Office of the Vice President for Research, has been a big partner with us here. The next slide just shows that there's many more than the title sponsors, and I want to point out just two folks or two entities tonight. One of them is the Galileo Circle members. And the Galileo Circle members, which are all sitting here in the front, because they pay for it in many ways, the Galileo Circle members support the College of Science with their time, with their funds, and it's sort of like the Rotary Club of the College of Science. And I thank you all for being friends and for supporting the college, for your advice and for your financial support. Thank you so much. The second entity I'd like to point out tonight is the Honors College. And the Honors College is a newcomer here in supporting this. And what they've done is they've given us the funds so that we can actually have a course for high school and middle school teachers to come here, get continuing education, listen to the lecture, get credit for the lecture, and their tuition is funded by the Honors College. So thank you so much for that really important point. We will be discussing the rest of these in the next lectures. Now, you may want to ask, what the dickens is, what are we talking about, uncertainty or certainty? And I think the next video will describe to you the problem.
Science is constantly producing new studies, as you would know if you've ever watched TV.
A new study shows how sugar might fuel the growth of cancer.
A new study shows late-night snacking could damage the part of your brain that creates and stores memories.
A new study finds pizza is the most addictive food in America.
A new study suggests hugging your dog is bad for your dog.
A new study showing that drinking a glass of red wine is just as good as spending an hour at the gym.
What?
That, my friends, is the problem. Science in itself is complex, and their terminology that we use, we make it even more complicated. What's a hypothesis? What's a theory? What's a law? How do all these things relate? And it becomes sort of fuzzy as arguments about scientific issues come about. Sometimes those arguments are not real arguments, they're really political arguments, but in some cases, the arguments truly have to do with the state of affairs in science. I like to joke with my friends that the media makes us look like bad engineers because we don't actually know what we're doing. But in fact, there's a very big difference between science and engineering, which is important for everybody to keep in mind. Science tries to understand the world as it is, with all its complexities, and the more we learn about it, the more complex it is. Engineering is creating a world that never was. And in fact, that's not very important, but it's a completely different set of ideas. It's a completely different way of looking at stuff. Now, this non-science business is not just new. I mean, now we can watch it on TV, or we can see it on the web, or listen on the radio. And sadly, it creates an enormous amount of anxiety in everybody because nobody really knows what is good science and what is bad science. But it's been around forever. And the next slide just shows just an example from the past. In 1860, a general, Pleasanton, he just decided that what made plants grow was blue light. So you can actually think that, right? He didn't know anything about photosynthesis. He didn't know anything about anything, but where you have blue light, things grow, and when you don't have blue light, in the darkness, nothing much happens. So based on that sort of theory, he went back and created a whole bunch of articles that described how blue light actually operated. So he created these books, and just like in anything else, marketing is important. And after he wrote all these things, which described in this slide here, in which there's all kinds of things about electromagnetism and how the atmosphere is stuck to the Earth. Because anyway, the guy had big ideas, even though they were all wrong. But it was fake news. It was fake science because it did not follow the scientific method in any kind of way. He actually then created, at least he had the sense to create a greenhouse, or there was a blue house, where he had blue panes, and he was able to show, and I'm not exactly sure how the experiments were done, that this blue house would create bigger grapes, it would create bigger pigs, and anything you put in blue was better. The newspapers picked all of this up, and they said, holy smoke, this guy actually has this thing about blue theory. So then everybody started wearing blue glasses because it was good for your health. And it became viral. But of course, it was until science caught up with this, and there was an article later on, about 10 years later, which was published in the Scientific American, which actually showed that all this was nonsense. The problem these days is that a lot of what we consider nonsense because we don't understand is not nonsense, and a lot of it is nonsense when it shouldn't be. There are huge debates about vaccination of kids. There are huge debates about global climate change. 50% of this country does not believe in evolution. About 50% of this country does not believe in global climate change. And it's not because of the state of affairs of science, it's the way that the state of affairs of science is portrayed. I hope that at least this crowd will get to recognize how we go about science and how we have a very robust way of understanding what we know and what we don't know. The lecturers here, today's lecturer, Joanna Masel, is going to talk about more or less the advent of statistics and how experiments in which you can compare groups and do a careful statistical analysis makes a huge difference in how you deal with stuff. The lecture after this one, which is about black holes, and Freyala Orsell is going to talk about that, is more the sort of the traditional physics kind of way in which you can actually create laws without actually even understanding what drives those laws. But they're laws because they always happen. So understanding what happens versus always happen is very different. Laws versus hypotheses versus theories. And we'll go down the list in which each one of the speakers will be describing a way in which we understand science today. Big data, data driven by dumping an enormous amount, science being created by dumping an enormous amount of data into a problem, and then from that coming up with a hypothesis and so on. So I think it's going to be extraordinary. It's a very different kind of lecture we've had in the past, in the sense that we don't have a theme, but the theme itself is science. I hope you enjoy it. And let me now introduce the first speaker. Let me just get this out of here. Joanna, come up here. What did I forget?
6 scientists explore the debates and discoveries shaping science today.
In searching for certainty, scientists focus on truth.
I'm very interested in how the mind and the body interact.
Microbes literally shape our lives.
Understanding statistics is the only way we can evaluate messy data.
With supercomputers and robot floats, we can see the future.
There is an unseen universe.
Searching for Certainty begins at Centennial Hall Tuesday, January 15th at 7 p.m.
Okay. Now, another thing that you may have all noticed is that all of our speakers are women. And let me assure you that they're not here just because they're women. They're here because they're the best. Many of them have actually spoken in the lecture series before, so I know how good they are from first experience. Joanna is a theoretical biologist who researches foundational questions about how evolution works. She also dabbles in many other fields, from biochemistry to education economics. She did her doctorate in philosophy in Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, a postdoc at Stanford, and joined the University of Arizona Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology in 2004. She's fascinated by the different forms that competition can take, in particular the tension between zero-sum races in which the number of winners or losers are set in advance versus competitions in which the numbers of winners can go up as part of real progress. She spent her last sabbatical writing a book, Bypass Wall Street, a biologist's guide to the rat race, bringing insights about competition from biology into economics and finance. This talk also draws from her experience developing and teaching an undergraduate course in evidence-based medicine, which supports with support from the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. Teaching this course has intersected with her interest in the psychology and philosophy of chance events and driven much of what she will explore in tonight's talk. Please welcome Joanna Masel.
So thank you so much. So you guys, you all came here presumably because you are searching for certainty, and us scientists are going to help you get there. And here am I, always the contrarian, straight off the bat telling you, too bad, you can't get what you want, there is no certainty. But I think where we agree right off the bat is that science is amazing. And we do know more and more all the time with ever-increasing confidence whether or not you say that adds up to certainty. And I think that's good enough to get going with. But the question is how? And this is the theme for this year. How is it that we know what we know? So I'm going to start by actually asking you that. Like, what is it that you think makes for good scientific evidence? So imagine you got some disease, pick your own nasty choice, and I'm going to give you a choice between two options. You've got a nasty disease and you've got two possible treatments you can have. And either I'm going to give you the results from 1,000 patients who aren't you. They've got the same disease, but there's a gazillion ways where they're different to you. And those 1,000 patients have been randomly divided into two treatments and been given those treatments, and you can tell how well they did with one treatment versus the other. And in the other option, it's going to be all about you. I'm going to tell you your genome, and we're going to do an enormous amount of molecular and cellular biology and physiology and everything that we can in order to understand what the different mutations that we find in those genome might mean for the biochemical and physiological pathways and so on. So I want a show of hands. How many people would rather have evidence A? Put your hand up. And how many people would rather have evidence B? It's about 50-50 is my sense. Okay, we're at about 50-50. Okay, now I'm going to give you another problem. So here's a knuckle bone. So it's an irregular object, and you can use it a bit like a dice. And you can roll it, and when you roll it, you can score which side came up on top. And I'm going to give you this knuckle bone, and I'm going to tell you to roll it exactly once. And before you roll it, you're going to predict which side comes out on top. And again, I'm going to give you the choice between two different kinds of evidence. So in one evidence, I'm going to say, okay, we already rolled it 1,000 times, or maybe 1,000 different people rolled it, or something. And here's how many times each of them came out on top. And in the other evidence, I'm going to give you a complete technical diagram that shows the center of mass, and you can take that further. We can build a machine that standardizes as much as possible what the angle it's going to be thrown from and its starting position, and so on. So now I'll have you vote. How many of you would rather have evidence A? How many would have evidence B? Okay, so it's still split. But there's a lot more evidence A people on this question than there was on the last question. All right, so now I'm going to ask you a new question. What would you do with the, what would you do with the data if I gave it to you? So if I gave you A, I'm pretty sure you know what to do with it, right? You're going to pick the one that came out the most often. And if I give you B, I certainly wouldn't know what to do with it. I could give you some physics books and engineering books and whatever. Maybe you could figure it out, but personally, I don't think so. Okay, so what I think is, let's ask the same question about the other. If I gave you evidence A, would you know what to do with it? Sure you would. You'd take the treatment that led to 500 people doing better than when they got the other treatment. You'd know exactly what to do with evidence A. If I gave you evidence B, I think it's really interesting that more of you said B for this question, for the knucklebone question. So you're telling me that it's easier to figure out how human beings are going to react in the real world to all sorts of complex things than it is to figure out how a knucklebone is going to roll. So I think you can tell that I'm an evidence A person, and that's what this talk's going to be about. And I think the comparison between the knuckle bone and the randomized trial of patients is really interesting. So I came across this knuckle bone example when I was reading the literature on education research. And this tendency to pick B, which you saw with the knuckle bone too, there are people who vote for that and there are students who give that answer. It's known as the outcome orientation. And what it means is that people are focused just on one outcome. They're not thinking about groups. They're only thinking about a single outcome and thinking about it in a way that rejects the whole idea that the universe might be random and thinks that everything is knowable. And when you interview people who have the outcome orientation, they'll say that statistical evidence is not real evidence. But evidence A, which we actually know what to do with, of course, evidence B is real evidence, but of course we wouldn't know what to do with it. And this is common and it comes up and, I try and address it in my teaching and so on, but I think it's really important. And the reason we hold this outcome orientation is because, we don't want the world to be random. We don't want to say, okay, this one came up on top 40% of the time, so that's the best I can do. It was better than the other three. When you do that, you quantify your uncertainty, and then you accept that uncertainty. But when you go with option B, you think, I want a world in which there is no uncertainty. I want to really know that. Keep giving me more and more and more information that I can't make any sense out of because I believe that somebody is going to get certainty from that information. And evidence A, okay, we accept uncertainty. We accept that not everything happens for a reason. We accept that the world might be just random. So people have called me courageous for giving this talk because I'm going to go directly against human psychology, the outcome orientation, and a whole lot more. If people hold the outcome orientation even for a knuckle bone, this outcome orientation is a whole lot stronger when you're talking about medicine because, of course, you only care about the next outcome. That's your life. The whole scenario is set up to encourage you to have this outcome orientation that far fewer people have when it comes to a knuckle bone, but it's still there. So I'm going to ask you, especially those who voted for the technical diagram, to bear with me, give me some forbearance. I'm trying to do something hard here. I'm going to give you a talk that pits my arguments against everything I know about human psychology and is stupid enough to think that I'd win. So, of course you're free to disagree with me, but, try and suspend disbelief, disagree with me now, and then go home and think about it afterwards. That's what I'm asking you all. All right, so now I'm going to change tack a bit and go back to the beginning of the story as far as I'm concerned, the beginning of data science, and this particular way of knowing what we know, with a man who I think was the greatest data scientist, not just of the 20th century, but of all time, Sir Ronald Fisher. And exactly 100 years ago, he took a job in a not particularly impressive agricultural laboratory. That's what he could find. And they handed him an enormous data set and said, go figure it out. So the big data of the era was leather-bound books, but they had 70 years of it. For 70 years, they'd been planting different crop varieties, watering in different ways, using different fertilizer, recording everything that happened with the weather, everything you can think of. They wrote it down. And then, of course, they said what yield they got from the crops. And so they had a massive data set, so big that it was hard for him to work with, despite inventing modern statistics. The sophisticated machines of his day was a hand-cranked mechanical calculator, so it was quite a lot of work. But the really fascinating thing is, despite having, you would think, all the data that you could possibly want, at the end of it, he couldn't figure it out. And he said, you know what? I can't tell you anything. And the reason for that was because all of those different variables, many of them changed together rather than, randomly and separately. So you couldn't tell which one was important. And the technical term for that is they're confounded. The data hadn't been gathered in the right way, and so it was useless. And Fisher described this as raking over the muck heap. And basically he'd said that his job, not just coming in as a statistician, but his job literally coming in and inventing the field of statistics in order to do this, was simply to tell them why 70 years of experiments was a complete and abject failure. He did get one paper out of it. But going forward, what he did is he said, all right, enough of that. Let's do it differently now. And this is what he recommended, and this is what we still do in agriculture today. So we divide land into squares here, and then we set up a scheme of the things we want to vary. We can vary the crop variety, we can vary the irrigation, we can vary the fertilizer, we can vary the blue light if we like to. And then we randomly, using dice, using chance, we randomly assign each treatment we want to study to squares. And we leave it to chance, and that's the way that we get the best possible information out. So he invented what we call the randomized experiment and put it into practice in England in the 1920s. Okay, so I'm going to fast forward to 1996 and change to medicine. So a large study was done on a bunch of nurses, and it asked, are you taking hormone replacement therapy or not around the time of menopause? And then it tracked what happened to them next. And what was clear from this study is that those who did take hormone replacement therapy had less heart disease. And there were some doctors who used this evidence to tell women, whatever your problem is, you should be on hormones anyway, even if you're doing fine with menopause, because, hey, lowers your heart disease. So some people obviously got over-enthusiastic, and other people weren't convinced. And they said, that's not how it should be done, according to Fisher. And in 2004, they organized actually an even larger study that followed Fisher's recommendation, that took a bunch of women and took away their decision to decide for themselves whether to take hormone replacement therapy or not, and gave that decision to random chance. Of course, the women all consented to leave it to random chance, and then the dice made decision, and the dice decided, rather than the women deciding, who was going to get it and who wasn't. And what was really interesting is the study got exactly the opposite result. Those taking hormones had more heart disease. So the point of this is not to tell you whether to take hormone replacement therapy or not, because the reasons for taking so usually don't revolve around heart disease, and the effect is small and there's many other effects. But the point of this is to say that these two facts can't both be right. Either it causes heart disease or it prevents heart disease. Which one is it? We have two studies that both look good. Which one is correct? And the answer is that the randomized trial is correct. When there's a conflict in this case, there's no question which one is correct. And the particular thing that's wrong with the other study is what's called confounding factors. So the main confounding factor that's common in studies like this is some women, of course, have more money, some have less. They're more educated, they're less educated, generally better off. And women who are better off are obviously healthier. And women who are better off might also, back in the 90s, be more likely to take this cutting-edge innovation of hormone replacement therapy. So if you have women who are anyway more likely to be healthy, doing something, then you're going to say, oh, look, the causal thing is the thing that those healthy women do. But that's not the reason that those women are healthy. Those women are healthy because they're richer, more educated, whatever. And the problem here is the lack of a control group. What we know with observational data is whether the women taking it or not taking it do better or worse. But what we don't know is that if we took that set of women and forced them to do the other thing, how would they do? And that's the question when we're choosing a treatment that we want to answer. We're not interested in correlation. We're interested in causation here. We want to know how taking this hormone or any other treatment will cause us to do differently than we would have done otherwise, which is a counterfactual, which is a statement of causality. So I'm sure you've all heard somewhere warnings that you have to, you can't, it's very important not to confuse correlation and causation. And just because you have correlation, that doesn't mean you have causation. And what I see when I teach is that students get so enthused about this that they start thinking that it's an impossible problem, a sort of nihilistic perspective that you can never tell correlation and causation apart. But the brilliance of Fisher was that he found a way of doing that. If you take a bunch of people, and this one's not hormone replacement therapy because there's men in there, and you randomly assign them to two groups. If you control the cause, it's called an intervention study because you intervene, take charge of the cause, and then, of all things, give that control of cause to dice. If you do that, then you can tell the difference. So you may say, but hey, what happened to all those confounding factors? Why aren't they, why are they suddenly not a problem? And of course, the confounding factors are still there. These different individuals, for example, are wealthier or poorer. But what we do know is that we can calculate the mathematics of how differences in how wealthy they are translate to differences in the two groups. We can use the mathematics of probability to do that, and specifically to calculate if I have a study this size and their patients vary this much, how different do I expect the two groups to be anyway, just because of the confounding factors? And the beauty is that's not just the confounding factors that we know, certainly not just the confounding factors we can measure. That's all confounding factors, known and unknown, obey the same laws of probability when we make them obey the laws of probability by using dice. And then we know how big a difference between the groups we should expect, and then we can look for differences between the groups that are substantially bigger than that. And that's how we reach reliable conclusions. So because the randomness, random assigning to groups, the basic you don't have to understand all the statistics, but the main point here is I can say that any particular value on the left is 50% likely to be in either the top or the bottom. And all of the fancy math follows from that. And it's 50% because we made it. So this talk is kind of ironic for me personally. I'm standing up here and I'm saying the only way to do science is random assignment, which is kind of weird because I'm actually primarily an evolutionary biologist, and I study a lot of questions in really deep time. And you certainly can't go and randomly assign things that happened billions of years ago and wait and see in another billion years what happens. So luckily for me, as you'll see in the rest of the series, there are other ways of getting at answers in cases where we can't do this amazing innovation of fishes. And so I'm just going to give you a simple example that's not from my field, but it's from probably most of our daily lives. So here's Google Translate. It blows me away how good it is, right? That I can just type something and get comprehensible language out. I mean, that's just fantastic. So I'll give you a quick, this is all machine learning and it's all observational data, and I'll give you a quick tutorial how it works. So it starts, of course, with data. Lots of data, preferably. And that data is basically just correct translations. Here's it in English, and here's what a human translator would make it in Spanish. And then you divide that data into two groups. We call training and testing, and we keep them carefully apart. And then you take the training data, and the computer scientists will get very excited about telling you the details of the black box. And I'm not going to do any of that. I'm just going to say, there's a black box that does predictions. And it uses the data to train itself to predict, okay, here's some English. What would a translator put in Spanish? And then you take the testing data set, and you use the black box on it. And then the final step that seems to be pretty much inevitable in any study like this is the authors always declare victory. So a question to ask is, should they have declared victory? And just say the results look good, right? Was it correct of them? Did, what are the circumstances under which, even if the results look really impressive, it is appropriate to declare victory? And so when we discuss that, we talk about the validity of the study, and I'll make a difference between internal validity and external validity. So internal validity means are the claims sound in their own context? So does the claim follow from the evidence? And the interesting thing about internal validity is it doesn't just depend on what sort of study or evidence you have. It also depends on what sort of claim you're trying to make. So I'll distinguish between two different kinds of claims. So in one claim, all you need to do is prediction, and prediction's a kind of correlation. You're trying to predict, what would this be in Spanish? Will this woman have a heart attack? You're making a prediction. And in the other, you're trying to confer a causality. So the causality is what would have happened if we had done things differently. So if you're just trying to do prediction, the bar is much lower. So really, all you need to know is that the translations were actually correct. If I put nonsense in and trained it to do nonsense and then tested it on nonsense, there is a technical term for that in the field. It's called garbage in, garbage out. So, but that's enough. That's the main question I need to ask if all I care about is prediction. But when I care about causation, then I also need to ask about confounding factors. If all I care about is prediction, well, confounding factors are fine. So what? They're confounded. I don't care why the woman did or didn't have a heart attack. I just want to predict whether she will. But if you want to know what would she have done, what would happen differently if she, then you need to worry about confounding factors because you need to isolate the cause. Okay, so the other sort of validity is external validity. And that means, what happens when you go outside the context of the study? Obviously, you don't have external, say hormone replacement therapy is for menopausal women, and there's not a lot of external validity in trying it out in men, right? Similarly, with Google Translate, I had fun trying to break it. I assumed it had been trained on prose and had fun trying poetry out on it. And here's the Jabberwocky by Lewis Carroll. And for those who speak French, the last line here, it's a little bit misspelled, but it looks a little bit like the mother's becoming Egyptian. So I broke Google Translate because I exceeded, it's wonderful, but I exceeded its external validity. Okay. So let's go to another machine learning example that's really exciting today. A lot of people are excited at what use we can make of machine learning for cancer. So by now you hopefully have this idea, all right, the first question we should ask is what is the internal validity of the study? And in order to even ask that question, you have to say, well, what is the claim? Not just what is the study, but what is the claim that is being made? What is the purpose? Why would you do machine learning on cancer? So there's several different answers to that. So the easy one that you've got lots of internal validity to is to predict how long somebody would live. You know, remember, all we need to do there is make sure the data is correct for prediction. Well, it's pretty easy to measure how long somebody lives. And then you have the data you need to train a machine learning algorithm. So that one's fine, but I don't think it's useful. I mean, it's good to know, but I don't think it's what people are most interested in. Another thing that a lot of people do is they use machine learning to classify cancers into different types. So this one, where's the internal validity here? We don't know what the different types of cancers are at the beginning of the study, right? So we have a problem here. If we don't know the data we're feeding in to train with is correct, we don't know what we're getting out. So what we can train with, the best we can normally do is, well, we'll try and train it to give whatever answer a human expert would get. But it's like, okay, so why is it that we're doing that? And there's a few different reasons. If it was like Google Translate, the reason would be that it's faster and cheaper, but I'm pretty sure that's not what most patients want for an answer for this. But there are much more useful things to do. So for example, you can train it on what a human would say, and then you can say, even though I trained it on what a human says, it keeps stubbornly disagreeing for this category. Let's do some more research into that. So it can be used not necessarily to immediately help patients, but to identify interesting cases for future research. And another thing that's sort of more directly useful is if you can take something upstream and use it to predict downstream. So for example, if you have a radiology result and there's a high rate of it being false positives, you could train a machine radiologist not on what a human radiologist would say, but on the subsequent data that comes from a biopsy. And maybe if you got that trained well, you could avoid a bunch of biopsies because, you know, you could say with more confidence perhaps than a human if the human training happened to work better, or the machine training happened to work better than the human training. So there are uses for classifying cancer types, but I don't think they're really what people most care about. You know, what people really most care about is they want that original evidence B. They want their cancer genome to go into a prediction machine and change what treatment they're going to get so that it's the best possible treatment for them with no uncertainty. And it just can't do that. Because should I take treatment A or should I take treatment B is not a prediction question, it's a causal question. And in cases like this where you're asking a causal question, there is only one method that we have to reliably answer them. And that one method is Fisher's method. So we can ask, well, how do, you know, Fisher's method is the statistics of groups, right? How are we going to use Fisher's method to personalize treatment? And there are a couple of different ways of doing it. One is to use these types. So you have some reason to believe that different types are different. So gather a bunch of patients that are more similar to each other, that are of that type, and do a randomized trial that's just on them. And then another type, do a randomized trial that's just on them. And see, maybe drug 1 works better for the first type, and drug 2 works better for the second type. So the machine learning here can be used to generate hypotheses that these different cancer groups might be different. But to answer the question that the patient really wants to know, how should I be treated? You know, hypotheses aren't enough. you have to follow up and do the randomized experiment to truly get the answer. There's another method, actually. You can randomize the whole prediction machine. If somebody claims to be able to build a prediction machine that will take your genome or take your knuckle bone or whatever and tell you with total certainty what you should do, great, let's test the whole machine. So we can take our group of patients, and one group can be assigned to the machine, and the other group can be assigned to whatever the current standard of care is. And so many of the patients assigned to the machine are going to get the standard of care, but a few of them won't. And this study will answer the question that the person in the starting group should be asking, which is, statistically, on average, am I better off doing this personalized medicine thing, or am I better off with the standard of care? And it can do that even though the personalized medicine thing does different things for different patients. So randomized trials still work. They can do all sorts of things. And they're known as the gold standard because of this. And the gold standard makes it sound sort of venerable and stuffy. It makes it sound like, you know, it's much more fun to attack them than to defend them, you know. You don't want to defend something that old and stuffy, right? But I think what people don't get about it is how recent they are. They are less than 100 years old since the first one was done. So think about this in the context of the history of science. We understood the fundamentals of quantum mechanics before we understood that if you wanted to know which medical treatment was better, you could try randomly dividing up people and seeing which group did better. Like, that concept was harder than quantum mechanics. But that's what history tells us. It's such a simple idea, and yet so hard. So it took a while. It wasn't instant. You know, Fisher did this in the 20s, but it wasn't like doctors started doing it immediately afterwards. In fact, it took an unusual series of events. So the first published randomized trial was on pulmonary tuberculosis and being treated with streptomycin, and it was in 1948. So there was a bit of a delay. And it's easy to sort of say, well, of course, you know, it would have happened eventually, fine. Some things happened between the 1920s and 1948. But it isn't inevitable in the history that this would have happened at all. People thought that it was thoroughly unethical to withhold treatment from people. And of course, people still do think, you know, if you've just discovered this wonderful new antibiotic, how could you possibly deny people with a potentially deadly illness this drug? How could you justify having a control group? So the history of this is interesting. So the reason this worked is because streptomycin was discovered in the US during World War II. And in the UK, after the war, when times were pretty tough there, and they had received exactly one shipment of streptomycin from the US, it wasn't nearly enough to treat everyone, and it had been shipped to the Medical Research Council, which was completely controlled by statisticians, all of whom were fans of Fisher. So that was the historical circumstances. They were in physical control of it. So they argued, all right, fine, we get it that, you know, you don't want to withhold treatment, but unfortunately, obviously, there's no choice. We don't have enough. We can't give treatment to everyone. So we think, as statisticians, that the fairest thing to do would be to draw straws for it. And it just so happens that if we draw straws for it, We can use Fisher's method and we can learn all sorts of science that under normal circumstances it wouldn't be ethical to do. And most of the doctors' response was you can't do that, that's still unethical because I know that this kind of patient is more likely to do well and this other kind of patient is less likely to do well. So you should prioritize who gets it on this basis. And then, of course, a different doctor might make a similar argument but argue for a completely different kind of patient. And then the statistician said, too bad we're in physical controls, so if you want any, you've got to take part in our study. You don't have any choice here. So the study went ahead. And so now we can ask, would it have been unethical? You know, was it a wonder drug? Did everyone assumed it would be fantastic? Was that true? And the answer is kind of mixed bag. So the patients did improve, substantially at the beginning. And then they evolved resistance to the antibiotic, and this was the first time anyone in science had seen that phenomenon of the evolution of resistance. And you'll learn much more about microbes from wherever she is, Dr. Vescelli's talk, in a few weeks. And then on the flip side, they had substantial side effects. They didn't live longer or recover more often in the end. So they had, some temporary recovery, but they also had serious side effects. So in 2020 hindsight, this would not have been unethical. The two groups actually kind of came out in a wash. The real winner of this trial was not instantly treating tuberculosis. It was the randomized trial. Because after these unexpected results were found, the tuberculosis doctors said, okay, you've persuaded us. We can't predict what's going to happen. We're going to need to keep doing these trials. So, for example, the standard of care at the time was enforced bed rest, pretty draconian. People weren't even allowed to read and write in many cases. And the people who were allowed to go home randomly assigned to go home, did equally well. No difference. The standard of care was useless, and it was essentially massively, the sanatoria are all closed and people were essentially released from prison. We couldn't cure them yet, but they got to go home. And then later, of course, we kept playing with the protocol for the antibiotics and found a way to get it to work. But it wasn't the first trial. And the method was needed in order to get there. So this comes into the question of, double-blind experiments, which means neither the patient nor the doctor knows who is getting which. So most of you have probably heard that the reason we do that is because the placebo effect is so powerful. Well, that's funny and all, but it's actually not the reason. So I could give a whole talk on placebos, but I don't have time to give 2 talks right now. But what I'm going to say briefly is they're not nearly as powerful for most things as popular discussion would make them sound. They do have some effects for subjective outcomes, for behavioral outcomes, but nobody's ever seen a placebo effect for whether or not you live or die or get over infectious illness or anything like that. You can just assume that there aren't sort of mind over matter type placebo effects for those kind of conditions. The real reason that we need to do double-blind experiments lies in the history of several failed trials before this streptomycin one. And what happened during those trials is the doctors cheated. Because they were so sure they knew which patients should be getting the drug and which ones shouldn't, that they would manipulate the experiment and cheat and get patients into the group. And so the only way to be 100% sure that doctors aren't doing that is for them to not know what the groups are. So that's the dirty secret of the history of medicine, of the real reason we do randomized trials in a double-blind format. And that's because ultimately, even though we do them, we don't like them. Because we don't like uncertainty, we don't like probability, we don't like leaving human fate to the roll of dice. And we want there to be a reason for things. We want there to be causes. And you can hear that in the language we use around medicine. So, for example, a question people often ask is, well, some people respond to this drug and some people don't. So, you want to do research into what it was about those people who responded and what it was about those people who didn't respond. So let me break that language down. Respond. That's a causal statement. We're saying, we don't know causality here. We've got two observations. This patient took the treatment, and this patient did well. We don't know whether they would have done well anyway, the counterfactual that you need for a causal claim. We don't know that. And you can see, and then we go further and we say, okay, not just the treatment was a cause, but there were more causes, which was the particulars of that patient. Not the particulars of that patient in doing well or badly, but the particulars of that patient in responding to the other cause. So then you can see what's wrong with this language if I flip it and say, what happens if you gave not even a placebo, no treatment at all? We don't talk about responding to not being treated. But we have the same information that they weren't treated and that they did well. So we're slipping causation in a place that really doesn't belong. And we do that because we want everything to have a cause. That's part of our psychology. And so, we see it from remarkably little evidence, like one patient, even as we deny it from large randomized trials, because those large randomized trials force us to accept the residual inherent uncertainty of the universe. And that's how it is. That is the universe. I can't change it. Right? By doing science, I can reduce the uncertainty, but I can't get rid of it. But when I talk about randomized trials, when you accept evidence that comes from randomized trials, your brain can't process it unless you accept uncertainty. That evidence A requires you to accept uncertainty, and that evidence B doesn't. So evidence B sounds good. But the irony is that if you go for evidence B, you're turning your back on the best method that science has to reduce uncertainty. But yeah, the world is complex, and that's how it is. So, but people don't want to say that that's why they don't like randomized trials. So human beings, if our actual reason is randomized trials, uncertainty, ick, you don't want to say that that's what your problem with it is, right? And humans, especially intelligent humans, are remarkable at the process of rationalization and coming up for really intelligent-sounding alternative objections and saying, no, my reason for disliking it isn't ick. This is my real reason, and then comes something very fancy. So I'm going to go through some of those fancy things that I hear a lot. And I'm going to go through what one of those common criticisms is. And then I'm going to tell you what I think the obvious solution to it is. And then I'm going to tell you what I hear instead. And spoiler, here instead always involves abandoning randomized trials. So a common criticism is the patients in randomized trials in medicine aren't representative. They're younger than normal patients, they're healthier than normal patients, they have fewer other conditions at the same time. And that's all true, absolutely true. And I agree with them that this is a problem, and there's an obvious solution. Enroll more representative patients, problem solved. And it's really interesting, that's not what these people tend to suggest. They tend to suggest using non-randomized forms of evidence. And I know that it's a crazy rationalization because sometimes I even see them suggest forms of evidence that don't have better external validity than the trials they're criticizing. So, an objection we've already seen in the streptomycin case is the idea that it's unethical. How could you possibly deny somebody, you know, this treatment and have a control or a placebo group, you know? That's really unfair to the people in that. So obviously in streptomycin that wasn't the case, but we could ask. You know, we've been doing trials for a while now. How often is a case? And one example is in pediatric oncology. People went over a period of time and they looked at every randomized trial that had been done in that period, and they said, for how many trials was a kid better off getting the new treatment that everyone was excited about and thought would be better? And on how many trials were they better off getting the former standard of care? And the answer came out pretty much exactly 50-50. So there isn't an ethical problem. You know, and some of this has been done in some other fields and, you know, other areas of medicine, and probably we should do some more of it. But as best we can tell, there is no ethical problem. And the solution to this so-called ethical problem is to embrace the truth that it's not there. Because, you know, the idea is if the doctor thinks they know, well, the doctor doesn't actually know. Nobody knows until the evidence is there. It doesn't matter how smart you are, what your background is, what you've studied. If the evidence doesn't exist, then you don't know. But what gets proposed instead, for example, are things called right to try laws. I won't talk about them in any detail except to say that they have the effect of undermining FDA's ability to enforce randomized trials. So another common criticism is we can't make drug approval depend on randomized trials because they're so slow and so expensive. So the first thing I want to say is, okay, how slow and how expensive depends on what? If you want to look at, say, how people with antidepressants do over 6 weeks, which is what most of the studies are, all the studies, 6 to 8 weeks, then all you need to do is wait 6 to 8 weeks after enrolling them and so on. It's quite quick. If you want to know what we actually probably care about, if you keep taking them for 2 years, what would be the effects? There is no human way to get a result in less than 2 years. You have to wait for the patients to have that much time pass. And that's not about the randomized part of the trial. If you want to know a 2-year outcome, you have to wait 2 years, okay? So it's not about randomized, it's about what you're interested in. It's true for all forms of evidence. As for the expense, one of the components of the expense is how big the trial needs to be. And one of the things that comes out of the mathematics of statistics is if you want to see an effect that's half the size, a difference between the groups that's half the size, you need 4 times as many patients. And so that relationship has 2 effects. Firstly, it means if you want to look at really small things, like small preventative actions, you need an enormous study. But there's another side to it, which is if you want to look at really big effects, a tiny study is actually enough. So I'll give you an example that I wrote about during the West African Ebola outbreak a few years ago. And just say you have Ebola and it's killing 70%, and you have a new wonder drug that reduces that to 10%. And I did the math of statistics on it and said 7 doses of the drug, randomized, 14 patients would be enough. And you'd get the answer in a couple of weeks. And you don't need to do anything fancy. You just need to make some placebos, make some drugs, hand them out in the field, and have the doctors report back whether the person died or not. That's it. No big change to their operating procedure. Of course, when the effect is that big, you will see it, even without a randomized trials. When effect sizes are enormous, you don't need fancy statistics or methods to see them, but it would take more time, more expense, more uncertainty at the end. Could you say, oh yeah, but all the ones who got the drug were treated at a better hospital than the ones who didn't get the drug, and maybe that's the reason, and you got all these confounding factors. So, in fact, in a case like this, the fastest way to get the evidence that we need is a randomized trial, and that's generally true. If you give it out from the very first dose in a randomized trial, from the first patient, it's going to be faster than any other method of getting the answer. So yeah, so we've talked about, you know, that being slow and expensive is not about randomized trials. Being slow is about, you know, what sort of timescale the outcome's on. And being expensive is partly on how many patients you need, but it has other factors. And to solve those other factors, you know, that are specific to the randomizing part, my answer would be make it easier to randomize. And the US is not very well set up for this, but the UK is. So in the UK, you know, they can do things, you know, firstly, people who run trials don't need to pay for the health care of the participants because the government pays for that anyway. And secondly, they have centralized electronic health records. So if I go in and I'm at high risk for heart disease and they decide to give me a statin because my cholesterol's so high, and they don't want to know which statin is better than which other statin, press a button, it says, okay, you've been randomly assigned to this statin, enter it in, and then some other researcher 10 years later can pull the data on whether I had a heart attack or not that's in the files. Simple. You know, we have decided to make randomization difficult because, in part, we are morally uncomfortable with it. It doesn't have to be that way. And of course, what's usually suggested is not to do randomized trials. Instead of systematically experimenting on a few people in a way that leads to us learning the most, the alternative is ultimately to unsystematically experiment on a much larger number of people in a way that teaches us less, and that gives more scope for the manipulation of the results. So on the good news front, in some areas, randomization's really taking off. Silicon Valley have given it a new name to make it friendlier and more appealing. It's called A/B testing now. And so some of you, I'm sure many of you were here for last year's lecture. We had Luis von Ahn, who talked about Duolingo, and they randomized people who were trying to learn a language to different conditions and get information and make their program better, and nobody complains. They're doing randomized trials on you all the time in Silicon Valley. Sometimes we complain, but usually we complain. You know, the basic thing is if A is ethical, and if B is ethical, and if doing either A or B, essentially randomly but totally unsystematically, depending on whatever, if that's ethical, why should it be unethical to use dice to decide whether to use A or B? So a lot of our objections are ultimately objections to we think that either A or B might not be ethical, and that's a real objection. But if we're totally sure that A and B are both ethical, we shouldn't put any barriers up. And when it comes to things like, you know, tweaking an algorithm that helps you learn a language, we usually don't. I think there was a lot of outcry of Facebook study that was tweaking your emotions because we felt bad about both A and B in that case. But when we feel fine about both A and B, then this should be good in all kinds of areas. So there's a lot of potential here. They're increasingly, but not nearly enough, being used in education. They're increasingly being used in economics. They're not being used in criminal justice, but they could be. You could do a randomized assignment of cases to drug court versus criminal court and follow up outcomes of interest however many years later. There's enormous potential to improve so many things about our life if we do the experiments. If we gather the data, if we design it in the way Fisher says, if we accept that the universe is intrinsically uncertain, and so it's okay to stay uncertain, it's okay to get that uncertainty down, except that it's never going to zero. And it's by accepting uncertainty that we learn the most in an intrinsically uncertain world. So thank you.